Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Except this particular voyage is not a voyage of the Starship Enterprise because they blew it up in the last movie. And it isn't even really a voyage into space because most of the action takes place on Earth, in San Francisco to be exact, before it became a Logan's Run-like bubble city where only Silicon Valley nouveau riche could afford to live because a studio apartment costs $6,500 a month. Anyway, I digress. Let's start back at the beginning of this ongoing voyage into the bold future of mankind and figure out just where the hell we are in this bizarre and confusing universe. In 1964, when the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was approximately 319 parts per million, a former LA cop and airline pilot named Gene Roddenberry pitched a half-baked science fiction show to a couple of TV executives, a series he described as Wagon Train to the Stars. When Star Trek premiered in September 1966, it earned middling ratings at best, was popular mostly among college students, and limped along for 3 seasons of increasingly diminished quality until it was finally cancelled in June 1969. Star Trek might have been forgotten, a few moldy half-inch videotape reels decaying in a Burbank TV studio vault, but then something happened that no one saw coming: the 1970s. With the exception of a small fan gathering that occurred in a public library in New Jersey in 1969, the first real Star Trek convention happened in 1972, and a phenomenon was born. As the gestalt of Star Trek continued to build throughout the rest of the decade, inevitably Roddenberry was approached to do a movie. Overlooking the most obvious pitch for a Star Trek movie, which is a scenario where the Starship Enterprise encounters a planet populated entirely by Kirk's illegitimate children, Roddenberry and director Robert Wise boldly went where many had gone before, with the ill-advised Star Trek: The Motion Picture in 1979, which attempted to bridge the gap between Star Wars and 2001: Space Odyssey without really understanding why either of those movies was a cultural thing. But the phenomenon of the Star Trek movie had now been born, as well as the infamous even-odd thing. Odd-numbered Star Trek movies sucked, while the even-numbered ones were great, despite the continually deteriorating quality of William Shatner's toupee and the progressive audacity of Leonard Nimoy's contract demands to appear in the next movie, until by the time of Star Trek IX he was demanding total creative control, $40 million in non-consecutively numbered bills, and coronation as the Holy Roman Emperor. I exaggerate, but not by much, and so that brings us to the mid-1980s, that brief moment in environmental history after James Watt had been sacked as Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, but before people started freaking out about radon gas in their basements. It was a time when being an environmentalist meant defending cute animals like seals, and yes, I suppose whales, but well before anyone wanted to talk publicly about climate change, despite the fact that by 1986, the year this movie came out, the carbon content of the atmosphere had risen to 337 parts per million, and the oil majors had liquidated their climate science research divisions. But none of that matters when the lives of cute animals are at stake, not to mention the survival of planet Earth, and especially when there's a couple million in grosses to beam out of the box office if you can get a transporter lock on it. So join us now on the continuing voyage of Podcast Green Screen. Mr. Sulu, that's all I can give ya. She's breaking apart, sir. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Hello, and welcome to Green Screen, the environmental movie podcast that traveled millions of miles to talk to a whale. I'm Sean Munger. I am a historian, also a climate change communications consultant.
I'm Cody Clymer, and I am a movie nerd, also married to the historian.
We're doing a new podcast called Green Screen, and the concept behind this podcast is we're reviewing, but we're analyzing movies that have something to do with the environment or environmental themes or something like that. It's not all going to be, Aaron Brockovich and Silkwood type stuff. We have some really eclectic movies on our list. The environment is, we define that concept very, very broadly. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that maybe you won't have thought of in environmental environmental sense.
I'm going to make him watch anime.
Yeah, that one's going to take some wine for me to get down, but that's okay. All right, well, this episode, which may end up being the first episode, I don't know, but we're talking about Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Very interesting movie that we saw not long ago, and many people do recognize that it has kind of a sort of an environmental theme.
Early kind of, early Greenpeace 80s view of environmentalism, I think.
Yeah, I think its views of what environmentalism is are very reflective of the era where it was made. I mean, it was the Reagan era. In our notes here, we're going to talk about Reagan a little bit. So, film was made in 1986. Just to nail that down. And we're not doing any of the other Star Trek movies. So far as I know, I don't think any of the others would really qualify for this series, would they?
No, I mean, I would love to talk about Star Trek movies because I'm that kind of nerd, but I don't know if we want to stretch the audience's trust on just hearing me nerd out about Star Trek movies.
Yeah, this is not a Star Trek podcast per se, but we're starting with Star Trek. So those of you who are Star Trek fans are gonna have to bear with us. Okay, so shall we dive into this bad boy? No pun intended.
Yes.
Okay. So, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, Paramount Pictures, 1986. The release date was November 26th, 1986, day before Thanksgiving, actually. Director was Leonard Nimoy, who, of course, plays Spock in the film and in most of the Star Trek incarnations. The producer was Harve Bennett, who I believe produced Star Trek II as well, and some of the other early sequels. The writers were Steve Mearson, Peter Krikes, Nicholas Meyer. The only one of those I've heard of is Nicholas Meyer, who directed Star Trek II, and Harve Bennett, with story credit going to Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy. And we've got the usual Star Trek regulars in the cast: William Shatner as Captain Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Bones McCoy, James Doohan as Scotty. Do I really need to go through them all? You know them all. And we have our guest stars, what you might call our guest stars, non-typical Star Trek cast members, including Catherine Hicks as Jillian, the whale scientist. And, well, I guess just everybody else is really a bit part in this, to be honest. Cost $21 million to make and grossed $133 million. That's not adjusted for inflation, but even at that figure, this was the most financially successful Star Trek picture ever. In fact, the success of this film sparked Paramount's interest in creating a new Star Trek TV series, which eventually became Star Trek The Next Generation.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I saw, I don't know if you mentioned it later, to get Shatner to appear in the movie, they had to bump up his pay, and they took that out of the Next Generation budget.
Really? I did not know that. Is that why all the effects in the first season of Next Generation look so chintzy?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, they could have spent it on some better scripts, too.
Yeah.
I mean, Angel 1, come on. Okay, so synopsis of Star Trek 6, Star Trek 4, Star Trek 4, Voyage Home. Okay, this is a sequel. So the beginning of the movie has to take care of a lot of business from the previous one, Star Trek 3, which was god-awful, by the way. The Enterprise has been blown up. Kirk and the others are stranded on planet Vulcan after bringing Spock back to life. For some reason, the only ship they have is a banged-up Klingon ship, and I don't quite understand how they got in this position, but I'm sure as hell not going to go back and watch Star Trek 3 to find that out. So they're having a merry old time on Vulcan, which looks incidentally exactly like the Vasquez Rocks just outside of LA, filmed with an orange filter. Those of you who are Star Trek fans would definitely recognize this landform. I'll just say one word: Gorn. So they're tooling around on Vulcan, and then meanwhile a mysterious probe that looks like a very large turd with a glowing Voight volleyball hanging off of it approaches Earth, making these weird squeaking noises in the vacuum of space, which does not transmit sound waves. So all of Earth's ships, especially those with multi-ethnic crews, they go dark, and the ocean mysteriously starts turning into sped-up stock footage of thunderclouds. The president of the Federation, who looks more like the junior vice president of a Midwestern bank, sends a distress call where he tells everyone to stay away from Earth because the probe is vaporizing our oceans. Kirk and his gang are on their way to Earth, and when they analyze the turd probe's squeaks, they run them through a couple of Audacity audio filters. Spock realizes that the probe is speaking the language of humpback whales. They conclude somehow, now I'm a little foggy on this point, but they conclude that the probe is unaware that it's destroying Earth. So exactly how they reach that conclusion, I have no idea. There's a lot of things in this movie that just don't make any sense. Anyway, apparently some whales on another planet sent this thing to come talk to the whales on Earth, and now they're basically parked in orbit saying, hello, hello, anyone down there, why haven't we heard from you? Do I have this right so far?
Yeah, and also it's pretty much a better structured version of Star Trek the Motion Picture of Earth being in peril because a big thing comes out of nowhere wanting to blow up the planet.
Okay, so key plot point. This film takes place in the 23rd century, and Spock tells us that humpback whales have been extinct for 200 years. So, of course, the mission is that they have to go back in time to Earth in the past, find humpback whales, bring them forward in time, and hope they'll tell this probe what to go do with itself. And that is a direct quote.
From Bones. That's a Bones thing, right? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I love Bones. He's my favorite Star Trek character. Okay, so after a visionary time travel sequence involving weird morphing white head sculptures of the Star Trek cast and some footage of water bubbling up inside one of those big jugs you see in office water coolers, the gang arrives at Earth in the late 20th century, presumably the year 1986, and Lieutenant Uhura tracks whale songs coming from San Francisco. The team lands in Golden Gate Park, and then they split up into 3 groups. Uhura and Chekhov have to go find some radioactive isotopes to fix the ship's engines, which crapped out during the water cooler sequence, and they do this by infiltrating the aircraft carrier Enterprise, which is a kind of an interesting sequence. Scotty, Sulu, and Bones have to get the materials to build a whale tank on board the spaceship, and Kirk and Spock go after the whales themselves, which are 2 humpbacks in captivity at a San Francisco aquarium. Their handler is a cetacean biologist. That's a whale expert for those of you lay people. She's played by Catherine Hicks, who is distrustful of our enterprising duo at first, but gradually gets mixed up in their wacky adventures, and hilarity ensues.
It's an 80s kind of, it's just a typical fish out of water movie. And,
no pun intended.
Yeah, a little bit. You see, what are some other ones? We got like Trading Places.
Back to the Future, certainly.
Yeah, Back to the Future. Just such a trope in 80s movies. Nimoy wanted to do a lighter movie after how serious 2 and 3 were. He thought they were too heavy.
Obviously, the main environmental aspect of this movie involves species conservation, humpback whales to be exact, but as we'll see, there's a lot more to the subtext than just that. Although they did not intend this, I think we can read this film as being an allegory for climate change. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you've talked about the difference between environmentalism and conservation. And I think this is where you can see maybe a shift in the thinking from conservation to environmentalism, in kind of like how those things have a different way of interacting with the environment.
That's a really good point. My PhD is in environmental history, and this theme comes up in environmental history, at least in environmental history of the U.S., where conservation is like, think of John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, national parks, like early 20th century, were like, conserving the wilderness, which is a problematic concept to begin with. But then environmentalism, as I think you're using it, is more, that comes about in the 1960s. We're talking about ecology, basically, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And there was a sort of a gradual shift over from conservation to environmentalism. I think it's telling that it occurred several decades earlier than when this movie was made. So they're a little bit behind the times, but as we're going to see that.
Hollywood usually is. They make stuff, they nail the point, like, well after everybody's kind of past it, usually. True.
Very true. Okay, so let's start with humpback whales, and we'll move outward from there. The scientific name of the humpback whale is Megaptera novae angliae, if I have that right. And they are found mostly in the North Pacific, North Atlantic, and Southern Oceans, meaning around Antarctica. Okay, here's the punchline. Do you want to make a guess as to what the official conservation status of the humpback whale is, as classified by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature? And they have a scale that runs from extinct to one end to least concern on the other. You want to guess where the humpback whale falls on that spectrum?
It's got to be terribly endangered.
Actually, it's not. They classify it as LC, or least concern. The species is not even threatened, not even close to extinction.
Sacre bleu.
However, it was not as true in 1986, although the movie still exaggerates the threat that existed at that time. Humpbacks were listed as a vulnerable species at that time, but they were nowhere near the brink of extinction. And in fact, the species was actually rebounding pretty robustly at the time this film was made. So there were technically more humpbacks in 1986 than there had been at any time before large-scale whaling started. And that's obviously true today, too. The thing that made the difference was the International Whaling Commission banned the hunting of humpback whales in 1966, 20 years before Star Trek IV was made, and ironically, the year that Star Trek premiered as a series. So prior to that time, it was estimated that there were only 5,000 humpbacks left in the world. Today, the worldwide population of humpbacks is estimated at about 80,000. That seems awfully small for a whole species, doesn't it?
They're big.
Well, yeah, they're pretty big. But still, 80,000? I mean, 80,000 in the world, that's incredible. So anyway, that's still obviously pretty small, and about half, and 80,000 is about half the population that was estimated to exist in the 19th century before the intensive period of hunting began. So between 1947 and 1972, it's estimated that the Soviet Union alone caught 48,000 humpback whales, while telling the world that they had only caught about 2,800. Far be it, of course, from the Soviets to lie.
Or, any kind of government there on that kind of thing.
Sure.
So what were they used for? Do you have any idea?
It's surprisingly unclear to me, because we're going to talk about whale oil here in a minute, and they were not, in the 20th century, generally not hunted for oil, at least not in the same way that they were in the 19th century. I know that cosmetics use whale products, and I know that the baleen, which is the stuff in their mouths. There's two kinds of whales. There's toothed whales, which like sperm whales are toothed whales. And then humpbacks are what they call baleen whales, where the way they eat is they filter water through these like kind of silky fibers in their mouths, and that strains out the plankton that they survive on. And the baleen does have some kind of industrial usage. But so far as I can tell, that there's a line in the movie where the whale doctor says, most of these applications can be achieved synthetically, and that is, so far as I know, true. So, but still, that seems 48,000 humpback whales. That's a lot of baleen. I mean, I don't know what they're using it for.
Yeah.
Much closer to the story that they tell in the movie about the humpback whale is the true story of the blue whale. And this is quite famous as the largest animal of any kind on Earth. The blue whale was much more numerous before hunting began, with a world population much more numerous than the humpback, with a world population maybe around 300,000. And there are today about 25,000 blue whales left in the world, and they are considered endangered. However, although blue whales were decimated, especially in the early decades of the 20th century, there was also a moratorium on hunting them imposed the same year, 1966. And by 1986, the populations were bouncing back. Today, and this was roughly true in the 80s as well, today the population of blue whales increases by 7.3% every year. So there are 7.3% more blue whales in the world now than there were last Thanksgiving. Interesting statistic. They are not in danger of extinction now, and apparently were not in 1986 either. So this is really strange. Why did the filmmakers choose humpbacks as the species here?
So my guess is the plausibility of getting whales into whatever spaceship they were in, and the bird of prey the Klingon ship they're in is kind of small.
Is that what it's called, the bird of prey?
Yeah. And yes, okay. That kind of...
Well, you're going to be the expert on this show on stuff like that.
Yeah, it's not big enough. Even, like, you know, movies are always kind of wishy-washy, squishy with numbers on, like, what something is scale-wise to something else. But, I mean, that would be, like, blue whales are more than 2 times bigger than a humpback, I think,
2 to 3 times, I think.
So it wouldn't make any sense. The other thing is, like, it's, like you said, stock footage, I think. It's a whole lot easier to get footage of humpback whales breaching and jumping out of the water. It's like that's something blue whales don't do, so they don't have a lot of filming of them. That's
true. I didn't even think of that, because most of the time you see a real whale in this film, it's usually jumping up out of the water.
Yeah,
and that you're right. That seems like a pretty tough maneuver for a blue whale.
Yeah,
there's going to be. I don't think you want to be anywhere near that when that happens.
Yeah,
could swamp the Titanic. Anyway, so no, I think that's right. That the maybe the stock footage, they wanted to match that up, and perhaps they were just more. I don't know. Maybe they were more recognizable, or.
Yeah, I think, you know, humpbacks have a very particular look. I remember as a kid, whales, and like humpback whales in particular, were kind of like an icon of environmentalism and conservation. Wasn't there some sort of conservation org that had the humpback whale breaching out of the water as their icon?
Yeah, you know, I think you're right. And I'm just thinking about the slogan, "Save the Whales," which is a cliche now, but I remember growing up in school, and every time we heard about whales, the story was exactly what the movie said. It's like, oh, they're almost extinct, and we have to stop hunting them. Well, we already had stopped hunting them, but for the most part.
Except for...
Japan and Norway, but
yeah,
we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so it's worth a couple of words about the history of whaling in general. We're going to get into some environmental history. This is an extremely long and fascinating history. We don't have time to go into it. But what strikes me is just how intertwined the history of whaling is with the history of climate change. Whaling, of course, has existed since ancient times. Most seafaring countries had or began to develop significant whaling fleets in the early modern period, what we call the early modern period. That's basically 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Really, the golden age of whaling was the first half of the 19th century. And the explosion in demand for whale products is directly related to interior illumination, because whale oil was used in lamps. And this has to do, and again, we're so intertwined with history of climate change here, because this is about the Industrial Revolution. As the Industrial Revolution got going in the early decades of the 19th century, candles were not really cutting it as a source of interior light. People were now working longer hours. They were working into the night, which they didn't used to do in the pre-industrial era. And it's really hard to light a factory with candles. Whale oil had, of course, been used before since antiquity, but the demand really, really spiked about this time. The whaling fleet of the United States was in this period the most prominent in the world, and it was based out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. This is your classic Moby Dick period.
Very light book that you can read on this subject to kind of catch yourself up if you want to get more details.
Yeah. Moby Dick actually is just an amazingly fascinating book. Melville, who was a whaler, took to sea in real life on one of these whaling ships and wrote about his experiences. He makes the misconception that they identify in the film that he refers to whales as fish. In fact, they're not. Of course, they're mammals. The golden age, this kind of golden era came crashing to a halt in the last decades of the 19th century, beginning in the 1860s. Many of the traditional whales that were hunted were basically hunted out, especially in the Antarctic. But then, although the number of whalers greatly decreased, the efficiency of whaling suddenly got much, much better with the development of exploding harpoons and harpoon cannons. The harpoon cannon was being introduced in 1870, and then factory ships were introduced in the early 20th century. And also because more traditional species of whales that were hunted, traditionally bowhead, gray, and right whales, they were tapped out by this point. So this new technology enabled whalers to go after the much bigger and much harder to catch species like some humpbacks and especially blue whales. And so this is why the 20th century was so much more catastrophic for these species. By the 1860s, though, demand for whale oil went way down. And why was that? Because people started using kerosene for interior illumination. Kerosene replaced whale oil for the most part in lamps. And in urban areas about this time, gas, which is extracted from coal, started to be piped into buildings as a public utility. So this is the gaslight era.
Also the beginning of Standard Oil.
Yes. Standard Oil began 1870, same year that the harpoon cannon was first used. Anyway, the punchline of that gaslight era is that's why electric lights had such a demand when they were invented toward the end of this period. Okay, so first attempts to protect whales came in the 1920s with the League of Nations. It was not until after World War II and the beginning of the environmentalism era, basically 1960s, that these efforts started getting real traction. So by the 1980s, whaling as an industry was virtually dead. Countries that did not observe the bans, principally Japan and Norway, were sharply criticized. And it's so interesting. I've been to Norway. I have you and I both have Norwegian friends, and they're surprisingly stubborn on this issue. It's very strange.
Yeah, for like a little while, I watched there was a Discovery TV show about the anti-whaling pirates. They're trying to protect the whales in the Antarctic Sea and South Pacific from Japanese whalers. And I watched that for a little while. It's really kind of fascinating. They talked about the Japanese drive for the products of whaling, and there's not huge amount of demand, but they keep on doing it anyway. It's kind of like a cultural thing, and it's like people really aren't particularly interested in it commercially, but they keep on doing it as kind of like a cultural drive, even though they use these big giant industrial processes. And
that was my understanding too, that there's not really that much market for this kind of stuff. I said by the 80s, whaling as an industry was virtually dead, but that does not mean whaling itself has stopped, because of course there are countries that continue to do it, and I think it's crystallized into a tradition. And that's the thing with the Norwegians, is that this has been our tradition for hundreds of years, so why shouldn't we do it? Well, there's good reasons. Also, there's the issue of whaling by indigenous peoples, Pacific Northwest Native Americans, among others. This is generally treated differently in most countries. There's usually, at least with a lot of this kind of activity, there's an exception to the ban, because the ban is on commercial whaling. But these activities really can't approach the scale of commercial whaling.
Exactly.
So it's not really that much of a danger to whale species. So that's why that exception exists. Okay, so talk a little bit about environmentalism in the 80s. We don't have time to go through the history of the whole environmental movement, Silent Spring and the EPA, flaming rivers, that sort of thing. Major take-home points from this period. The election of 1980 brought Ronald Reagan to power in the U.S., and he had a noted hostility to basically any kind of environmental regulation. This is when the Republican Party started to become strongly associated with anti-environmentalism, where previously under Nixon it had been pro-environmental. Nixon, in fact, started the EPA. Reagan's Secretary of the Interior was a fellow named James Watt, a pro-business guy, also a little nuts. He gave away as much public land for ranching and fossil fuel development as possible, and he was also a fundamentalist Christian who believed that there were not many generations left before Christ's second coming, so why bother trying to protect the environment? You hear this a little bit today from some people.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so James Watt was also hostile to listing species as endangered, and actually, in point of fact, he didn't like much humans, very, very many humans either. He was famously cashiered from the cabinet after he described a government panel as having, quote, a black, a woman, 2 Jews, and a cripple, which is famously lampooned by Berkeley Breathed in, I can't pronounce his name, the guy who draws Bloom County.
Berkeley Breathed.
Yep. Yeah, I cannot pronounce his name, so sorry, Burke. Anyway, at the same time, early 1980s, EPA director under Ronald Reagan was a woman named Ann Gorsuch, whose son Neil was appointed to the Supreme Court by Donald Trump. Interesting how this comes around. So mid-1980s, species conservation was about the least controversial environmentalist idea. I remember, again, going back to childhood, I remember in elementary school in the 1980s, saving seals was a big thing. There were posters of doe-eyed baby seals everywhere. and the term clubbing seals as a synonym for villainy dates from this era. So the idea for Star Trek IV does not really seem to have been overtly environmental at the start. According to Nimoy, and we touched on this, they wanted to do a more lighthearted picture, and they were also interested in doing a time travel story that involved a problem in the future that could only be solved by obtaining something from the past. What I read was that Nimoy was, at the time they were developing this, reading a book about extinction of species, and so he hit on that concept after some trial and error story-wise. So the film does not seem overtly political to me, and it doesn't make sense really that a Star Trek picture would be.
Star Trek is political in ways that are comfortable. They do stuff that it seems controversial in some ways with a more polarized society, but wanting diversity on a spaceship and stuff like that, and trying to show that. Star Trek VI is about the ending of the Cold War, which is like a very political message.
Right, that's true.
Yeah.
But also the Cold War was largely over by the time the film came out.
Yeah,
so.
And so like this, it was like a little bit behind the...
Lagging behind. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned diversity because when Roddenberry initially pitched the show in the mid-'60s, it was rejected by most of the executives because he expressly included black people. Yeah.
But the public in general really loved the show because of its diversity once it was on the air.
Right. And there's the famous story about Nichelle Nichols, the actress who plays Lieutenant Uhura, speaking to Martin Luther King. And she was thinking about getting off the show because they didn't give her much to do except sit there with an earpiece and say, "Hailing frequencies open, Captain."
Yeah.
But King talked her into remaining on the show, saying, "Look, this is a positive, this is inclusion. This is a positive portrayal. This has never been done before. You have to stay." Okay, so let's talk about the film itself. Some points to discuss, and this is this really the first one?
You put that there. I did not put that there. I think it looks like a piece of chalk because I'm not scatological all the time.
Well, it sort of looks like a turd to me. I'm sorry. That's just what I see.
Whatever creature past that turd needs to go see medical professionals immediately because that's not healthy.
Well, it's certainly an unusual design for an alien spaceship, so you have to give them credit, I guess, for trying.
Yeah, and they don't show it very much. It's dark colored on dark backgrounds for the most part. They use reflections off of it to kind of actually show it rather than doing very much like direct viewing. It was kind of an interesting approach to kind of give it some mystery, even though it was like, to me, it looked like a chunk of chalk or something with like a volleyball dangling off of it.
Yeah, the little volleyball is, I guess that was supposed to be the communications pod, or I don't know.
Wizards.
Yeah. I thought it was a ship built by whales. Come on.
Yeah. Space whales.
Okay, so how come we have not seen this whale world in any other incarnation of Star Trek? Wouldn't this be really cool to go back and revisit this? At the end of the film, Jillian winds up in the 23rd century and she gets sent on a science vessel. She says she's going to do catch-up learning. So presumably, as now the galaxy's only existing expert on humpback whales, Starfleet would immediately send a starship out to Whale World to make contact with this species, and they would choose her as the ambassador, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be cool.
So there's your Star Trek V idea right there.
Yeah.
Not this stupid Paradise City thing that they did.
Oh, God.
Okay, so we have a Federation Council room scene with a bunch of aliens that I think is a Star Trek take on the famous Star Wars cantina scene. Not as effective, but interesting, I guess.
The coolest one is the cat person. That was like some really great makeup. There's some really, really bad ones, of course, but the cat people, that was very Wing Commander.
And all your base are belong to us?
No, it's a Wing Commander. It's like a space shoot 'em up. You're like flying a spaceship, and your enemies are these cat people. Mark Hamill did the interstitial videos for that. That was one of the things he did in the 80s, 90s. Yeah.
Okay, the time travel montage. This is what I refer to as the water cooler sequence. What was up with that?
Somebody did too much LSD.
LDS?
Yes, LDS. So there was a thing with a 3D model of a whale, or kind of looks like a humpback whale.
Oh, yeah.
But it didn't look quite right. And so I always look at that and I'm like, are they just really bad at making 3D models? Or is that the alien? Like the space alien whale thing?
Oh, I didn't even think
kind
about
of
that.
like, it's either bad 3D modeling or it's an alien. I don't know.
That's a really interesting take. I know exactly. I can see it in my mind what you're thinking of. It's a weird blob with like kind of fin-like things.
Yeah, but it's not. It doesn't look quite like a humpback whale. Like it doesn't look quite right.
Huh. So maybe that was supposed to be a depiction of one of the space whales.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so they park the Klingon ship in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, where even if invisible, they have a cloaking device. It will certain to be discovered by people running into it. In fact, those two joggers at the end almost do that. So there weren't better places in San Francisco to park a Klingon ship?
Can I do an aside about San Francisco that I think would be... I don't look good in this story. I do not look great. I went to San Francisco one time on my own. I was staying in a hostel. I was doing like the cool 20s thing. And I decided like, I'm going to go walk over from the hostel to Golden Gate Park and go see the Golden Gate Bridge, because that's what you do. So I walk through all these neighborhoods. I walk through Presidio. I walk through a golf course. I can hear the traffic of the bridge while I'm in this kind of forested area. And I'm on this trail and I see a sign that says like Golden Gate Bridge, like 1 mile. And I never found it.
Huh.
I lost the Golden Gate Bridge in Golden Gate Park. I had no idea how to find it. I just gave up. I could not find it. So I kind of think you may be able to like lose an entire spaceship in a park in San Francisco and nobody would see it.
Well, that's a fair point. Okay, I stand corrected on that one. Was it foggy on this day?
No, it wasn't. It was bright and sunny.
Wow.
I don't know. I still like laugh about not being able to find Golden Gate Bridge.
It's a great story. Okay, last bit of pedantry here. Now this one is legit. Come on. Okay, sometimes they beam back and forth onto the ship, and other times they open the hatch and walk out. After rescuing Chekhov from the hospital, they do both. They beam from the hospital to the park right in front of the ship. Then they open the walkway and get on board. But it's clear that they don't have to do this, because a few minutes later, after they've closed the hatch, Kirk is beamed back aboard from outside. So, does the friggin' transporter work or not?
I think it's lousy editing. Just like so many things about this movie, it's just like things were lost on the cutting room floor. You know, what that may have been is they didn't want Gillian being beamed directly into the ship, and since she was with them...
I don't know about that, but there was another thing, like right when she drops off Spock and she's like, oh, he's just going to hang around the bushes while we eat. And he walks away and you see him as he's walking, they're beaming him back onto the ship.
Yeah.
And they don't open the hatch.
Yeah. I know. It's like, it's 80s movie logic is it never makes any sense.
Okay. So last bit of that was our final bit of pedantry there. Okay. So let's talk about San Francisco in 1986, the kind of the meat of the movie here, which is very fascinating and the whole reason why they did it. Some interesting observations here. Kirk seems to know more about 20th century customs than Spock does, which I find a real interesting reversal. He knows who Harold Robbins and Jacqueline Suzanne are. No one even knows who Harold Robbins is today.
I have no idea.
Big selling kind of trashy book authors in the 80s, like Sidney Sheldon.
Yeah.
He was another flavor of Sidney Sheldon. But I cannot even remember a book that he wrote. Jacqueline Suzanne, of course, noted author of Potboilers. Her most famous book was probably Valley of the Dolls.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's Jacqueline Suzanne. Kirk also knows phrases like "everybody remember where we parked" and "I don't even have your telephone number." These are deployed for comic effect, I think. But it's interesting. I'm going to come to a headcanon here in just a moment. He knows about the free speech movement at Berkeley in the 60s, which is very interesting. Could one line of dialogue explain this? If he says something like, well, yes, Spock, I've read a lot about 20th century America. It's a hobby, or something like that.
I think that's kind of what he did in the bus, though.
Well, he hints at it. I don't think he actually comes out and says it, which, again, like just tweaking the dialogue a little bit would have made that clear. And it would have been an interesting reversal because Spock is usually the walking encyclopedia on everything.
Yeah. But they had to get to that pension of gotta nerve pinch that punk.
Right. Which is the scene everybody remembers from this movie, is the punk on the bus. We're going to talk about him in a moment.
Yeah.
So how long do they spend in San Francisco? It seems like just a day and a night.
That is I think one of the great things about this movie is how quick it moves. You feel the just rapid nature of their trip because they're there for like a night. Scotty says they have to do something within 24 hours, and so they kind of do get it, and you kind of feel that rapid nature of the movement of the plot. I think that's kind of a cool thing.
And that's a flip side. We were talking about the editing being maybe having some deficiencies, but this is a real strength of the editing, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right that it moves lickety-split, and it seems like the movie is 20 minutes long.
Yeah, it does not feel like it's 2 hours, I think.
It's not 2 hours, but it's maybe, I don't know, hour 45 or something like that, but it doesn't seem even that long.
Yeah.
It moves very, very fast. The stuff in the plexiglass plant, I love those scenes. That's like one of my favorite things in the whole movie.
Okay, computer.
Yeah. I love it how Scotty doesn't know how a mouse works, but yet he totally rocks that first generation 1984 Macintosh.
Well, it's a testament to how dumb computer mice are and like how timeless the weird QWERTY keyboard is. And I could imagine like where there are keyboards, they still have that weird QWERTY key layout.
Probably.
And nobody really understands why. Like, nobody understands why it's QWERTY now, but it's even more of a kind of like just strange anachronism in technology. I love to think about that part of it.
One thing that I just thought of that I think is like really cool about this scene is that like Scotty just goes crazy with the keyboard and he's punching stuff in and everything. But in every other 80s movie involving a computer, whenever they type on the keyboard, they have a dumb like that sound as you see like the character like War Games, for example.
Oh God, yeah.
But this was ubiquitous to movies in the 80s involving computers, where it's like the text going across the screen has this weird like extraneous sound effect, and they didn't do that in this one. They left it real, and I thought that was actually really cool.
Yeah, the things that he was typing had absolutely nothing to do with what was actually happening on the screen, but hey, it's fun. Sure,
but he also, like the character, and James Doohan, who's a great actor by the way, I mean, he makes you believe it.
Yeah.
Because from the series and the previous movies that he's an engineering genius, and he can just rock anything like that, and he knows exactly how to use a Macintosh because it's probably so basic, and or so intuitive with his knowledge of computers and engineering that he just makes mincemeat of it instantly.
Yeah.
And that's such a believable moment.
Yeah.
So I really love that, and just him and Bones kind of playing off each other, and
you can tell whether it's true or not. There is a kind of feeling that this was pretty fun to shoot. I think like they had a lot of fun acting with each other.
Oh, it must have been. It must have been a lot of fun because you can tell that they're having a blast.
Yeah.
On screen.
One of my favorite bits are like almost silent movie-esque reaction shots. Shatner like reacting to Nimoy ending up in the tank with the whales.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like that is what Shatner is good at, is that kind of just, he's so over the top all the time. Oh my God, I love it. It's one of the few times that I actually like Shatner's performance in something where it's like it feels like it fits.
I think you're right. I think this is one of his better performances as Kirk. because it is kind of campy, and he's so good at campy, over the top, but it's appropriate here, and most of the time it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
It's like his death scene in Star Trek Generations is just awful.
Ugh. Yeah.
But this really works. This really works. Less successful, I think, is the dinner scene. I mean, it's like, I really want to like that scene, but it's got some weird stuff in it.
It's him trying to peacock and game her into doing what he wants and failing miserably, but still her being like, you are terrible and you're such a terrible liar that I can tell that you don't mean ill. You don't mean bad. So I'm going to go ahead and go along with this, even though you're just absolutely terrible at trying to convince me to go along with you on this.
And she plays it so well. Catherine Hicks. She's great in this scene.
Yeah, she does not want to get in his pants at all, and it's very apparent, and that is just kind of so great.
Well, and what's amazing, again, a first for the Star Trek series, is he actually takes no for an answer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that and I was thinking about this as we were writing the notes, is there really is no sexual tension between them. They hint at it just very, very slightly at the end after they get back to the 23rd century. But in these middle scenes, you don't get the sense that he's trying to mac on her.
Or it's like, I feel like he's trying to, and he's failing, and she's just totally rejecting him. Could this be the only platonic relationship that Kirk has with a woman in all of the Star Trek universe?
I think it could be.
Yeah.
So, but this scene is so interesting because it's like they get to the pizza restaurant, and she orders a big pizza with all the trimmings and Michelob. But then, like, Kirk is surprised by the taste of the beer.
Because it's shit.
Well, Michelob is pretty crappy.
And it's in the butt plug bottle, which is even worse.
So, but I'm just thinking, this is the same guy who's running around the Enterprise in the first season, clutching a flagon of Saurian brandy and shouting, "I'm Captain Kirk! I'm Captain Kirk!"
He has no, even his terrible taste in alcoholic beverages, which apparently Romulan ale is a terrible beverage. Even Michelob Ultra is a stretch for Kirk to drink.
Oh, the alcohol of the Star Trek universe. We could do a podcast on that. Okay, now there was something that I really wanted to see after the dinner scene that we did not see, which is I wanted to see, because they take the pizza to go, and I wanted to see Kirk walking up to the ship in Golden Gate Park with the pizza box.
Yes.
And then what would have been even better is if they had done that, and then like later on when they're all working on the engines or whatever, like, or on the bridge, like having the pizza box open with like one piece left.
Yeah.
So
Sulu like guiltily eating pizza, like getting caught, in the middle of conversation. He's like, "What?" Oh,
that would have been so priceless.
Yeah.
Really priceless moment. Okay, let's talk about Jillian, the whale biologist, cetacean biologist, excuse me. So she's clearly not married and does not seem to be romantically involved. I mean, she rejects Kirk, but not because she's taken. The movie never seems to show or even hint that she has any kind of attachment. Presumably, I'm assuming this is what they want us to think, is that she's married to her job, although not necessarily the whales, George and Gracie, because the backstory establishes they only recently came to the Whale Institute. So it would have been nice to have some character development for her. How did she get interested in whales, and where did she go to school? Where do you learn this stuff?
I think in a more modern movie that kind of thing would have been explored more. But yeah, I mean, she is pretty two-dimensional in this, like in a series of movies that are notorious for their two-dimensional characters. She's pretty flat.
So I'm thinking, and again, this is my academic background. So like, does she work at the Cetacean Institute before George and Gracie get there? Or does she only come there to study them once they're there? So that would presume, if it's the latter, that would presume that she has a permanent position elsewhere, maybe at a university or something, and that she's only visiting or consulting at the Cetacean Institute.
Yeah, I don't think they thought about it that hard. I mean, it's like, and like she's doing tours of the Cetacean Institute, aka freshly built Monterey Bay Aquarium, that like, it's kind of obvious that the writers have no idea what a scientist really does. I'm lucky enough to be friends with some like really insanely smart scientists and stuff online, and
some of which are probably listening right now,
hopefully. And I think they would probably be just find the portrayal of a cetacean biologist in this like just very eye-rolly.
So you mentioned the tour guide thing, and that's something else I wanted to talk about. If they introduce her character as a doctor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she's Dr. Jillian Taylor.
Yeah.
Which means she has a PhD.
Yeah.
Presumably in cetacean biology. So she must be doing research work at this institute, right?
I'm sure it's like if they would have portrayed her doing real science, it would have been like a Frankenstein lab with beakers full of like food-colored water with dry ice thrown in the bottom.
Right. But you're right that the only job that we see her doing is as tour guide of the museum.
Yeah.
So I could see her, like, as a practical matter, doing that sort of part-time.
Yeah.
Like to help out, can you take, an hour out of your research to come give a tour guide? But that seems to be her only job at the Institute, which is weird.
It's kind of like Neil deGrasse Tyson at the planetarium type thing. It's like, I think that kind of view of scientists in the public sphere this was before that, of course, but that kind of idea, Carl Sagan-ish view of scientists in the public sphere, I think is what they were thinking of with her. And I don't think they've thought about it further than that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But again, okay, so forgive me for harping on this, but okay, Bob, the guy that she slaps later on, is that her boss?
I don't know.
The movie seems to imply that he is.
Yeah, which is like really great having her slap her boss. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people that would like to do that no matter what kind of work they do. It's kind of a fun scene.
So now here's a scene they didn't show us. Is there a cut scene here maybe showing her getting home to her apartment and it's completely stacked with books and pictures of whales and whatever? And of course, since this is a 1980s movie, they would probably add the detail where she checks her answering machine and we hear the voice of her mother, like nagging her to get married or something. Like
Jane Fonda's character did in China Syndrome.
In China Syndrome,
or,
right.
Batman Returns.
Yes, another movie on our list, Batman Returns. It happens in Batman Returns.
Yes.
As well, along with the automated, the horribly inappropriate automated cosmetic ads.
Yes.
That suggest that she's hot for her boss.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the kind of the usual treatment of unmarried professional women in these 1980s movies.
Yeah.
So, interesting casting choice. There was someone else they had in mind for this role. And who was it?
That was Eddie Murphy.
Eddie Murphy.
Which, whenever you told me this,
when I saw this on the Wikipedia page, I thought it was like vandalism. Like some, how people vandalize Wikipedia pages and it stays up for maybe 20 minutes.
So it's like what I'm thinking is like, it makes me think of like Beverly Hills Cop, which I may have seen or may have not. I have no idea, but I know it as a, Eddie Murphy kind of classic movie. I guess he's like an inner city cop that shows up out of a Beverly Hills police station.
Right. Well, you have Beverly Hills Cop. That was the biggest movie of the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the bee's knees. Seriously.
Yeah.
Everyone loved Eddie Murphy. Yeah. And the scenario was that he was a Detroit cop, and I think like his partner was murdered or something. And there was some connection to the case that went back to Beverly Hills. And so, yeah, then, cue the fish out of water. And then the sequels were notoriously bad, but the basic, that was the basic thrust of it. So, yeah, no, I wonder. I mean, maybe it's not, when you think about it in that light, maybe it's not so far-fetched that they were going to put him in this movie, but... Yeah.
It would have been interesting to have, like, Eddie Murphy playing a scientist trying to work with Kirk and Spock and all of them, and, like, them trying to win him over, him ending up in the future and everything like that. And I think that kind of points to the lack of chemistry that's shown between the Jillian character and Kirk, because that wasn't integrated into the plot, because the gender changed on that character maybe kind of late in the script writing process.
Oh, that's so interesting. Incidentally, the reason he didn't do this movie was he chose to do Golden Child instead. I don't know anyone who remembers Golden Child, but this sounds like a great idea on paper. And maybe there was a certain amount of relief that it didn't come off, because I can't imagine what tone this movie would have taken if Eddie Murphy had been in it.
Yeah.
Because first of all, he would have sucked up half the budget. He was the biggest paid star in Hollywood in the mid 80s.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he Beverly Hills Cop was a license to print money for him. He was the biggest star in the world.
Yeah.
For a brief period between about 1984 and 87. Like, he'd have sucked up half the budget. He probably would have doctored the script, and of course they would have given him a whole bunch of, room to mug and do his stand-up comedy routine. If Eddie Murphy had been in the movie, if they would have treated him as the same that they did her, as the unmarried loner who's obsessed with whales.
There's no time for any kind of like love interest stuff anywhere in this movie.
Okay, costumes. Let's talk about Kirk's pink shirt and quilted purple jacket and matching pants. What did you think of that?
I think it was more maroon than
was
purple.
it maroon? Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it was very... I mean, it's like it's an iconic outfit for Kirk to wear. Because, I mean, it's like... He kind of wore that in, like, all of them. Like, in some sort of, like, fashion, like, some modification of the weird pink shirt. And it's like it's such a weird pink because it looks like a white shirt, like a bunch of white shirts that somebody threw in a red sock by accident in the washer. It's like that kind of pink. I don't know if I noticed it as pink as a kid, because on VHS, on a CRT television, I don't think that pink would have come across. And I think it's something that I'm just noticing now with like HD on like a giant television.
That could be. I'm going to ask a question that we could not answer unless we go back and watch Star Trek 3, which we're definitely not going to do. But I wonder if he had that same outfit in that movie.
Oh, he probably did. A while back, I tried to watch it and I got like 20 minutes in and I was just like, nope.
It's awful.
Yeah, it was, man, and I love terrible movies. I will watch just total schlock if it's got nice pretty explosions in it, and I could not do that one.
I'm going to make a bold statement that's going to get a bunch of 1-star reviews. I think Star Trek 3 is worse than Star Trek 5. Don't at me, bro.
Yeah.
Okay, costumes. Now you have to admit Chekhov's leather jacket is awesome. I mean, it is right out of Shaft.
As a kid, I was like, I want that leather jacket.
But he had matching pants too. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I didn't care about the pants. I was like, oh, that jacket is cool.
It was awesome. It was awesome. And poor Uhura, she just has to tool around in that uniform. I mean, they should give her something interesting to wear.
Yeah. Bones' jacket is a weird ass thing that I think he was wearing in the first two as well.
No, because in the first movie, there's the scene where they beam him onto the Enterprise and he looks like a porn producer from 1978 because he's got that bell-bottom white leisure suit and the big medallions, and he has a beard.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God.
Oh, come on. You can't forget groovy Dr. Bones. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That was the highlight of that film.
Yeah.
God, are we going to talk about the toupees?
You talk about Shatner's toupee being terrible. The guy who plays Chekhov... His
Walter
toupee.
Koenig. Yeah, they're all terrible. Koenig.
His is terrible. His, like, monkeys. It's not even beetles. It's monkeys. That's just like, no. That's not convincing anybody.
Well, they're all just so bad. I mean, Shatner was bald as a cue ball in the 60s when he did the original series. I think all the rest of them lost their hair later, but it's like, I want to know. I mean, I'm not singling out Shatner because he's the only bad toupee. I'm just saying that his is by far the most egregious of all of the bad toupees. But my God, does his hair ever look like that?
It's like, it's so 80s, like that weird perm look. That was so cool. That like Kirk Cameron like had that kind of look in the 80s too. And it's just, I know the smell of like perm activator from a kid, and it's like, and I see his wig and that's all I smell.
Oh, that's hilarious. Oh, we forgot to talk about Spock's Holiday Inn robe.
Yeah.
Which he wears the entire movie.
Yeah, except when he was wearing the short shorts whenever he gets into the...
How could I forget that? Yeah, that was just such an odd costume choice. I mean...
I don't know if Vulcan fashion is 80s mid-range hotel leisure wear, I guess. Is that the aesthetic of Planet Vulcan?
I guess so. I mean, I don't know who's designing these things, but Vulcan needs some fashion designers. I think that's just atrocious.
Like some of the technical stuff, the thing I love, the whale shots that they've got. The underwater shots were shot in one of the special effect producers' backyard in their pool.
Really?
With remote control whales that they had created, and they just dumped a gallon of milk in the pool to like get it the right amount of cloudy to make it look like the ocean. And then they had just these remote controlled whales that I think were pretty great for their time.
The whale shots do look great. I mean, it really does look real. And I think there were a couple of shots where I could tell they were faked, but I probably couldn't tell. The fakes were probably on screen a lot more than I realized they were.
Oh yeah. Which is the best kind of special effect.
But then there's that terrible scene at the end with where the ship is in the water and they're all just kind of hanging on the side of it, and then they start pushing each other off, and that looks really fake to me. Oh
yeah, well, I mean, it's almost as bad as like the shark in Jaws. Like if you look at it too closely, it's like, oh, that's really bad.
Okay, let's get to that guys. Who's that guy? There's a lot of that guys in this movie.
And the list is crazy long. Guy.
We have to talk about the punk on the bus, though.
Yes. All right. So yeah, we'll save my favorite for the end. So we'll start with Kirk Thatcher, the bus punk. He was an associate producer on the movie, and they wanted him. They just grabbed him because he looked the part, I suppose, and they put some music on there. He didn't like it. He's like, let me just make something for that scene. And so he and his punk band, oh man, I wish I would have caught the name of the band.
It's called Edge of Etiquette.
Yes.
I looked that up.
Yes, the most amazing.
We can put in the show notes, there's a link. We can put a link to the YouTube video.
Yeah. Which
has that song in it. The song is called I Hate You.
Yes.
So convenient that you just happen to have a punk band.
Yeah. It's like from listening to a bunch of other podcasts, I know that he has kind of an interesting history, and we kind of dug up some interesting things. He was kind of tied in with Industrial Light and Magic, and through that, Lucasfilms and special effects in general, throughout the 80s and 90s, because if special effects were done and they needed to be good in that time period, it's like you went to Industrial Light and Magic.
Didn't he get involved with the Muppets too?
Yes. He directed dozens of Muppet movies and shows for TV. So I wonder if he did anything on the new Dark Crystal series that's on Netflix.
I would not be surprised.
Yeah.
Because if he's in the Henson shop, then he would have had something to do with that.
Yeah.
And I looked up his first job was as a technician on Return of the Jedi.
Oh, yeah.
So, and he got that job because his high school friend was Joe Johnston, who was one of the Industrial Light and Magic people.
Yep. That would do it.
So how awesome would that be? Your first job out of high school is on Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I love this quote. I could win the Nobel Peace Prize and my grave would still say punk on bus, Star Trek 4. It was pretty great.
There was a shot of him on his IMDb page, and apparently he's got like a big long beard.
Yeah.
And he's wearing like a top hat and like surrounded by all the Muppets, and it's just charming. It's really charming. Okay, so how about Catherine Hicks? What's her story?
So she started on Ryan's Hope. It's a soap opera from late mid-70s. And what I recognized her from was much later, and it was Seventh Heaven, and she played a mom on that, and that was late 90s and early 2000s. Same year, she was in Peggy Sue Got Married with Kathleen Turner in 1986.
Another time travel story, interestingly enough.
Yeah. So this is like really obscure, and nobody has seen this movie. We saw it. We had to really seek it out, and I don't really remember it very well, but it's The Razor's Edge, which came out in 1984. It was Bill Murray being his most Bill Murray, doing this World War I epic based off a novel. It's like, it is not funny. It is very not funny.
He was, I think, trying to get started as a dramatic lead.
And it's just, if he could have saved himself some time if he would have just waited and realized that he was going to be in Wes Anderson movies. He would have all saved us from having to watch The Razor's Edge, which was not a great movie. She was in that. I was looking into stuff about Bob, who was the guy that got slapped. He doesn't even have a picture on IMDb.
Yeah, the actor's name, I got Scott Devaney.
Yeah.
Just TV stuff mostly. His last credit was in 1999.
So the president of the Federation.
Tell me. Let me guess. 8 is enough.
No, he was actually Robert Ellenstein. And he played one of the guys that rounded up Cary Grant in North by Northwest at the beginning of the movie.
Oh, and the other guy was Martin Landau.
Yeah.
Oh, so they're the two thugs.
The two thugs at the beginning.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he's really interesting, and he started a couple of theater school and acting school projects in LA, and that's the majority. That seems to be like his real claim on history, is like being a supporter of acting and teaching and training. So that was his big thing. He passed away a few years ago. There's tons and tons of like also Rands and so-and-sos. There's a guy from Octopussy that was in there that's uncredited. He's playing on a screen in the background.
He's one of the starship captains, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've got that.
And he was actually a tennis star in India.
Yeah.
From what I understand. I looked him up. He has careers mostly in the 70s. Not a bad tennis player. He beat Bjorn Borg, Jimmy Connors, and John McEnroe.
That's pretty epic.
And he's now a UN ambassador for peace, specializing in AIDS prevention.
Yeah.
Interesting career arc.
There's the guy who's the admiral, the African-American guy that's there with the president in the control center, Brock Peters. And what you'll recognize him from, if you've watched even a little bit of Star Trek, is he was Captain Sisko's dad. He was kind of pivotal character in 2 Star Trek movies, original series, and then he was in the Next Generation universe as Benjamin Sisko's dad, who ran a restaurant in Louisiana on Earth.
Wow, that's really cool. See, I haven't seen Deep Space Nine, but this guy was also in To Kill a Mockingbird, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Okay, who's John Shuck? I was just so interested in that name. Just, you have to say it again. John Shuck.
Well, you would recognize him. He was, so this is my thing that I will always look for movies in a certain period. He was in Golden Girls 1 episode.
Golden Girls and Murder, She Wrote.
Yes. But of course he was in MASH. And so this was the guy that was playing the Klingon ambassador.
Right.
And he also picked up the role again. He played it in episode 6 or Star Trek 6, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, he was in St. Elsewhere, MASH, LA Law, and The Golden Girls.
Wow.
So
that's the trifecta of 80s shows right there. Yeah.
Also, another MASH connection is Dr. Nichols, the plexiglass guy that, if I was him, I'd feel like I was making some sort of weird Faustian bargain. And I don't know, the plexiglass devil would be coming for my soul at some point. But he was also in the MASH TV show, and he was one of the guys staring at Vag in Fatal Attraction.
No,
So,
actually, I thought he was on Fatal Attraction,
yeah.
but I researched it was a different guy. The
Oh,
guy,
really?
Yeah, the guy I'm thinking of is named Stuart Pankin.
Oh,
But I thought this was that guy, and it wasn't.
it's not somebody else. Oh, okay.
And actually, this time watching this film, I remember this triggered a memory for. Of course, I saw this movie years ago, but in those scenes, he's got a button on, and because I would always watch this on VHS, and the quality was so crappy, and you never really see the button head on, but now you see it in like a big enough TV, and the button says "I quit smoking."
Huh.
So after years, finally got to see what the button was.
Yeah. So you've got some of the classic Star Trek characters, actresses. You've got Grace Lee Whitney, who played the blonde that was constantly having to deal with sexual assault.
Yeoman Janice.
And was eventually, kind of driven off the show after she was sexually assaulted by someone who worked on the show.
So, I mean, how sad is that? It's like she gets fired. Well, first of all, almost all of her appearances on the show involve rape in some way or another.
Yeah, which is pretty gross.
I know, and especially that when I was mocking with the evil Kirk, Captain Kirk. It's like they basically imply that she's raped by the evil Captain Kirk, and then she gets fired from the show and then raped.
As I understand it, she was sexually assaulted by no one will say who, at least as I understand it, but it's she was sexually assaulted by a producer on the show.
That's horrible.
And was kind of driven off the show rather than fire the guy that sexually assaulted her.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible. Well, I found out something about her that was super interesting. She was, previously to Star Trek, she was one of the members of the girls' band in Some Like It Hot with Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis.
Oh.
So, like the whole, like the train scenes with the, where they're having the party.
She's one of the women in the background.
Right. She's one of the girls in the train that they all fall out of the berth when Jack Lemmon hits the emergency brake, and then she's got to be in the band when Marilyn Monroe is doing the I want to be loved by you number.
Huh.
One of her most iconic performances ever. So apparently I never noticed her, but next time I see Some Like It Hot, I'm going to look for her. She's great.
Yeah.
Another little tidbit about the time of the first Star Trek movie, apparently DeForest Kelley looked her up and found that she was unemployed, and said that people at Star Trek conventions had been asking him, well, whatever happened to Yeoman Janice? And so DeForest Kelley, was instrumental in getting her cast on Star Trek The Motion Picture. And she died, unfortunately, in 2015.
Yeah. And, of course, the Majel Barrett, if you're not super dipped into Star Trek lore, she's Gene Roddenberry's wife, and she was in pretty much everything. She did the voice of the computer in
Working.
Yeah, in the original series and also Next Generation, and she also played Counselor Troy's super horny mom, who is always trying to bag Captain Picard, and actually became like a really interesting character by the time Deep Space Nine came around. She was totally redeemed as a character, and actually I think they got some really great acting out of Majel Barrett by the time DS9 came around. But the one that I think is most interesting as that guy is uncredited, and at the beginning, she's uncredited and she has lines, which is always kind of a BS thing to do, because it's all about what they get paid, and if they are not credited, then they get paid less. And the Saratoga captain, who's not named, it's Madge Sinclair, and so she's interesting. You see her and you recognize her, She was Eddie Murphy's mom in Coming to America. She was Simba's mom in The Lion King, in the original, not trashy one that just came out in the last year. And also Geordie's mom, and also a captain again in The Next Generation in the last season. She was in one episode there. And she wasn't even credited. And she was like really, I think she made with the minimal amount of stuff she was given, she came across as like a really interesting captain.
Well, and she's the first person you see in the whole movie, right?
Yeah. And uncredited.
That's incredible that she didn't get credited.
Yeah.
And I mean, talk about the inclusion factor, because that's, the African-American woman captain. First time we've seen that in the whole Star Trek universe.
Yeah. So
wow, that she should have been. That's crazy that she wasn't credited. Absolutely crazy.
So yeah, there's like a ton of that, guys. It's going to be, as we go through movies, movies of a certain era will have a lot of that, guys. I mean, I went through this list and there were so many. T.J. Hooker, Macmillan and Wife, Murder, She Wrote, Diagnosis Murder, and they would play like 4 or 5 characters and like come back, once a season playing somebody totally different, no reference to the original character they were playing. That's kind of one of the fun things about watching these movies from the 70s and 80s that I find kind of endearing and fun.
A lot of fun. A lot of fun. Okay, well, let's start wrapping this up. So we're going to do, are we going to rate the film?
Yes. So our scale is on parts per million.
Of carbon dioxide.
Of parts per million of carbon dioxide. And the higher the number, the worse the movie.
And reflecting, again, this is a climate change thing, as we know, or as we should know, 350 parts per million is considered safe. Or below 350 is considered safe. Above 350 is considered dangerous. So if a movie scores above 350 parts per million, it's a bad movie. That's the cutoff.
Yeah.
So that's how we're going to do things here on Green Screen. So
yeah.
So from 100 to 500 parts per million of carbon, what would you rate Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home?
Oh, this is tough because it's hard for me to judge this movie fairly, as this was a movie I was raised on and saw over and over again, either in bits and pieces on HBO. I think we may have had it on VHS. It's not a great movie. It could have been edited better. It could have been directed a little bit better. But even with some of the weaknesses in it, it has some really great performances. As Jillian says, whenever with the plot of this movie, it's just a giant cock, a mamie tail. You have to see it. She pauses on that really oddly and smirks about halfway through it. I'll go 250.
Okay.
It's not like 100 or 150 or 200. It's like, I'd say it's like 250. It's in the middle. It's not terrible. It's not great. Looking through at it right now, 8-year-old me was like, this is the most amazing movie ever. But, nearly 40-year-old me is like, it's fine.
That's a great review. I think this is a tremendously enjoyable movie. It's, despite all the little nitpicks and pedantry that I have about it, and there are a lot of logical flaws, but it's fun. It's fun, and maybe that's why the fish out of water scenario worked so often in the 80s, is because it worked. It was a lot of fun. So seeing the Star Trek characters, walking down the streets of San Francisco, and the whole, well, double dumbass on you, and that kind of thing, and the plexiglass thing, and it's just, there's so many priceless moments in this film. So it's highly, highly enjoyable. I think as it deals with environmental issues, I feel like its heart is in the right place, but I also feel like it kind of missed the boat a little bit. And only part of that is because it was so late on the uptake of the whales being endangered or not endangered, or that being a convenient shorthand for environmentalism, or possibly they stumbled upon that because they were looking for something they could fit into the time travel plot, and that made a plausible story arc. So I feel like the environmentalism is kind of incidental and that they don't really drill very deep into it. But there is some substance there, and I think again, their hearts were in the right place, that it seems clear that they're making a plea, particularly when we didn't even really talk that much about the issue of whether whales are intelligent and sentient in the way that we define consciousness. I think they probably are.
Yeah.
But that seems to be the main stake that the movie is kind of planting out there. Like, look, this is another species on our planet, and they're intelligent, and look what we've done to them, and we need to rethink that. I think that's a really interesting message, even aside from the issues of environmental conservation, or even as an allegory for climate change, which I think you can read this film as. So I think there's a lot of good here. I think Nimoy is not the strongest director, but it is a fun movie. I'm going to come in... can I come in at 225?
I guess. I mean, we're making up the rules as we go. So true. I guess if you want to do quarter points, it's like it's not impossible. It's it makes me think like maybe we should be giving the movies 2 scores for giving them, I could give them a score for how good of a movie it is, and you can give a score for the movie about how well it conveys environmental issues and causes to the audience, and if it does a good job at that. Yeah, do you feel like this movie did a good job at trying to convey it at least?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there, because it's not just how good a job it does of conveying something, but what it's trying to convey. And I think all of the movies that we're going to be looking at have a different thing to say about the environment. So I'm a little wary of trying to force kind of my own values on that conversation. So, which is again why I say that I think this movie has something valuable to say. And I think we have to let what it wants to say sort of stand on its own. Yeah. And again, I think this fits totally into the Star Trek sort of ethos of, I'm in the introduction, I mocked the idea that this is not really a voyage into space, and that it's not a voyage of the Starship Enterprise, but it's like it sort of turns the Star Trek formula on its head, where they go out into the galaxy to find new life forms and civilizations. And here is a life form, an intelligent life form on our own planet, whom we have arguably committed genocide against. Yeah. And that's a provocative thought in the kind of way that the best science fiction gets us thinking about provocative thoughts.
Yeah.
So I think that is its chief value. And I really like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so next film we're going to be doing on
I don't
green
know.
Screen.
How many do I have to choose from? I'll pick a random number.
Pick between 1 and 10, but we've done 2 now, so I reserve the right to, if you already pick one we've picked, you'll have to pick
okay. Again. I'll go with 8.
Number 8 is, we're going back to the 70s.
Oh.
Donald Sutherland, Jeff Goldblum, Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
More gasp. And we're staying in San Fran.
We are staying in San Francisco. Another San Francisco movie.
Nobody in San Francisco calls it San Fran, as I understand it. But for my Bay Area friends, I will say it just to kind of just poke at you a little bit.
Okay,
but yeah.
So our next episode will be about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. A lot to unpack there. Oh, Leonard Nimoy is in this film.
Oh yeah, with his weird 2-finger glove.
Right, which I did not understand. Very
70s.
Strange. But again, more allegory for climate change, at least in my opinion.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's so great. We saw this not too long ago. I am totally okay with watching this again.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Again, this is Green Screen, so do the usual things. If you like this podcast, 5-star review, tell your friends, post on social media, that sort of thing. All those usual steps, because we're a brand new show just trying to get going. So
show us some love.
Absolutely. Hope you enjoy. And I have another podcast. It's called Second Decade, which is a historical podcast about the 18 teens and has a very environmental history angle in many of the episodes. So that's where you can find us.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Cody. Been a great time. And
thank you, Sean.
We're gonna beam off the bridge here and
I'll take the ramp.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.
Talk to you later. Bye. Green Screen is an independent podcast written and produced by Sean Munger, that's me, and Cody Clymer. You can find the website for this podcast at greenscreenpod.com. You can visit my website at seanmunger.com, email the show at sean@seanmunger.com, or catch up with us on Letterboxd, that's the movie rating app. I'm Sean Munger over there. Cody is Bearded Odalisque. Music credits. Our intro music includes an excerpt from Frisk by Awe, that's A-U. The spacey theme at the opening of this episode is called Space Explorers. It's by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, used under Creative Commons 3.0 license. The jazzy theme you're hearing now is by Zach Wilkins. This episode is copyright 2020 by Sean Munger and Cody Clymer. Thanks for listening. Good night.